You walk past parked cars that breathe slowly in their sleep. The streetlights cast pools of light that taste like old medicine, spreading across empty sidewalks. There's a woman at the bus stop. Her face seems to shift when you look directly at it. "I've lost my washing machine," she says. It was full of dead leaves and old photographs. The void is somewhere in the center of town. It's always been there as far back as anyone remembers. Some say it was there before the town, that they built the streets around it, careful not to look too closely. You can feel it pulling at the edges of things. In the supermarket, the freezer cases hum a low hymn. Inside, TV dinners are arranged in perfect spirals, each one containing a different memory of Tuesday afternoon. The fluorescent lights flicker and taste like copper. You remember the first time you noticed the void. You were young, walking home from school, when suddenly the air felt thinner, like something vast was breathing it in. Nobody else seemed to notice. There's a hole behind the pharmacy where the video store hides. The tapes are labeled with dates that haven't happened yet. You rent one marked "Yesterday's Tomorrow." The footage shows only empty rooms where something important has just happened or is about to happen. Another is simply labeled "The Void," but the case is empty, has always been empty. You try to walk toward the void in the center of town, but the streets keep rearranging themselves. A tower of mattresses looms overhead, each one stained with different decades. At the top, someone is making a bed with sheets of pale morning light. The laundromat washes memories instead of clothes. A child feeds quarters into one machine. "I'm trying to clean last Wednesday," they say, but it keeps coming back dirty. You pass a diner where all the coffee cups are filled with tiny black holes. The waitress serves pie made of compressed darkness. "The void moved again," she says. "It's hiding behind the post office now. But you know the void doesn't hide. We hide from it." The traffic lights change colors that don't exist. Cars stop and go according to rules written in a language that can only be spoken by distant radio towers at 3 a.m. Some say the void is growing. Others say it's always been the same size. We just notice it more now. You've heard it's shaped like everyone's forgotten dreams, or maybe it's the space left behind when memories fade. In the department store, mannequins made of morning fog try on clothes made of silence. Their whispers sound like distant vacuum cleaners. You find a microwave that cooks moments instead of food. Put in a minute of anxiety, out comes a warm memory of childhood. But something's always slightly wrong with the reheated time. The colors are too bright, the voices too hollow. The void has moved again, or maybe you have. Now it's supposedly behind the grocery store, but when you look there, you only find a parking lot full of cars sleeping, their engines humming old radio signals. The fog gets thicker as evening approaches. It tastes like old light bulbs and feels like television snow against your skin. Somewhere the void waits, patient as geology, quiet as the space between heartbeats. You begin planning the expedition to climb the mattress tower. The maps you spread across your kitchen table show different routes, though each insists it's correct. Streets curve around the tower's base in ways that seem reasonable until you try to follow them. A man who claims to be a mattress tower guide meets you in the diner. His business card keeps changing between your fingers. I've climbed it 14 times, he says, but when you ask about the route, he just lists different types of springs and filling materials that haven't been manufactured since 1962. The climbing store sells equipment that seems normal until you look closer. Ropes that stretch longer than they should, carabiners that ring like distant telephones when you clip them. The clerk measures you for a harness using a tape measure made of radiostatic. Sometimes you drive by the tower at night to scout the route. The stains on the mattresses form patterns that might be a map or might be messages from previous expeditions. Once you see people halfway up having a dinner party on a queen size from 1973. They wave, but when you wave back, they're just piles of laundry. Your planned climbing partner collects permits from City Hall. Each one is printed on paper that feels too heavy, with regulations that shift under fluorescent light. No climbing during hours that don't exist, one states. All expeditions must carry 3 items that were lost in the couch cushions of the municipal building. The tower seems to have floors like a building. You meet a woman who claims to live on the 1986 level. The rent is reasonable, she says, but sometimes I hear the void humming through the springs. When you try to organize a planning meeting, people arrive with equipment that changes as they unpack it. Helmets that seem too deep inside, harnesses that contain extra buckles leading nowhere, boots that make sounds like distant traffic when you walk. The base of the tower is surrounded by old television sets, showing only static, except sometimes you catch glimpses of other expeditions, unpacking the same equipment in the same parking lot. What seems to be a guidebook contains only listings of furniture store sales from 1958 and bus schedules for routes that never existed. The only useful page shows a diagram of the tower, but it's drawn from an impossible angle. Each time you set a date for the expedition, your phone rings with calls from numbers that are too long. The voices on the other end recite lists of items you'll need, but they're always things that stopped being manufactured before you were born. You find notes tucked into your mailbox written on old receipts. They contain directions that read like assembly instructions for Swedish furniture, or maps that become shopping lists when you try to memorize them. The preparation starts to feel like a ritual, gathering objects that resist being gathered, meeting people who might not exist outside of the planning meetings, studying the tower that remains unchanged yet never quite looks the same. The void watches from somewhere near the center of town, a perfect absence shaped like all the expeditions that never started. Sometimes you think you see it reflected in the windows of the tower, a darkness that's darker than darkness should be, waiting to see if you'll finally begin your climb that never begins. You meet your collaborator in a basement office filled with half-finished projects. They're building a miniature of the tower using old circuit boards and pieces of discarded furniture. The scale is wrong, they say, but you're not sure if they mean the model or the actual tower. Sometimes they forget they're your lover. They'll look up from a tangle of wires and ask, "Have we met before?" Then they'll remember halfway through explaining their newest idea, a virtual reality system made from modified ViewMasters and microfiche readers. You try filming the tower from different angles. The footage comes back showing a different building each time, though you're certain you never moved the camera. Your lover edits the films together in their apartment, but they keep cutting in scenes from industrial training videos from the 1970s. We need to capture the feeling of the stains, they say, pointing to a wall of photographs. Each photo shows the same mattress stain, but it keeps changing shape between glances, like a Rorschach test that's trying to communicate. They build a simulation chamber in their garage using old television sets stacked to the ceiling. When you step inside, the static forms patterns that feel like climbing, but the temperature keeps changing, and someone's voice reads out phone numbers that haven't been in service since 1983. Your lover forgets the project for weeks at a time. You find them in the public library studying technical manuals for appliances that were never manufactured. I remember loving something, they say, but I think it might have been the void. The simulations keep failing in interesting ways. One attempt using modified viewfinders shows only the spaces between the mattresses. Another, using audio recordings, captures the sound of springs compressing under the weight of years that haven't happened yet. In their kitchen, they've built a model of the tower using old refrigerator parts. The cold helps preserve the accuracy, they explain, but when you look inside, you see only empty shelves that seem to go on forever. Sometimes at night, they call you to describe new ideas, a zip line made of VHS tape, a periscope that sees through time, a series of mirrors arranged to reflect the tower's true shape. Their voice gets distant when they talk about the void, as if they're remembering something they haven't experienced yet. The final prototype sits in their living room covered in sheets. Neither of you can remember building it. It might be able to simulate the experience of climbing the tower, but you both know that looking under the sheets would ruin everything. They touch your hand while explaining the next iteration, then pause, confused. Are we in love? They ask. Or are we just trying to map the same emptiness? You notice the void listening from somewhere behind the kitchen wall, patient as ever. The phone lines between you and your former lover have grown thick and fibrous like old roots. You try calling but hear only a low frequency that makes your molars ache. Sometimes you catch fragments. The simulation. Need more copper. The tower looks different from up here. You find a manual for telephone repair wedged behind a radiator. The diagrams show connections that seem to lead into people's spinal cords, into the spaces between wall studs where insects lay arithmetic equations. A retired lineman agrees to help. He brings tools that get heavier every time you set them down. These wires remember things, he says, pulling a length of cable that wrinkles like skin. But when you look again the next day, he's left town to study obsolete switchboard operations in Nevada. You take night classes in electrical engineering. The professor draws circuits that fold into themselves, channels for voices to travel through the center of the earth. Your notebooks fill with equations that solve themselves when you're not looking, leaving behind small scorch marks. The telephone wires have grown into everything. They wrap around traffic lights, through the handles of coffee cups, between the pages of books. You follow one line that seems important. It leads you through 17 basements and into a room where all the spare keys in town are having a quiet conversation. A group of volunteers helps you map the wire paths. They bring old equipment, oscilloscopes that display tomorrow's weather, signal tracers that pick up conversations from 1947, crimping tools that reshape memories into better reception. But they keep disappearing during lunch breaks, returning as different people with the same names. Your former lover's voice comes through sometimes, distorted. I found a box of spare connections under my floorboards. They're labeled with names of people who never existed, but I remember all of them. The telephone company sends a technician who opens panels in walls, revealing corridors of copper and salt. She explains the problem while filing repair reports on paper that folds into impossible shapes. But her badge keeps changing companies, and her clipboard shows blueprints for buildings that cast no shadows. You learn about impedance and resistance, but the textbooks differ on whether electricity flows toward or away from loss. The calculations require numbers that can only be found in old phone books, written in margins by people who needed to call someone who'd moved to the void. Each repair attempt leaves the lines more tangled. They've started forming patterns that look meaningful from certain angles, like the way smoke arranges itself while trying to remember where it came from. Your former lover suggests these might be new forms of area codes, but you can't tell if the message came from today or last Tuesday. The void has taken an interest in the telephone system. Sometimes it calls wrong numbers just to hear them ring. The sound carries through the wires like a thin thread of darkness, stitching together all the conversations that never quite reached their destinations. Line untangling procedures must account for temporal cross-contamination between adjacent cables. When separating entwined pairs, technicians should first measure the crystallization rate of the copper using a modified Westbrook meter. If readings exceed 7 micro-oscillations per temporal unit, the lines have begun to exchange material properties. Speech pattern testing requires calibration of the harmonic resonator to detect crossbleed between conversations occurring at different points in the transmission timeline. Standard procedure for audio verification: apply contact solution of powdered carbon and dissolved voices to all connection points. Lines that have carried the same conversation for more than 15 years will exhibit a characteristic buildup of calcified speech patterns around junction points. When testing for signal clarity, splice a measurement loop using copper wire extracted from pre-war installations. Monitor for audio artifacts, including echo patterns that precede their originating signal voices, speaking in frequencies that can only be recorded on glass crosstalk between different decades of the same conversation, degradation of consonants into their component minerals. For severe entanglement cases, each wire must be traced using a modified galvanometer containing at least 3 grams of preserved silence. Any line exhibiting signs of molecular memory should be wound on spools made from reclaimed switchboard components. Pole maintenance requires careful attention to the crystalline structures that form an aging creosote. These structures often contain compressed audio fragments from nearby transmissions. When replacing cross arms, preserve any formations that show signs of organized resonance. Ground wire installation must account for soil conductivity and local timeline stability. Depth of burial should be calculated based on the density of accumulated speeches, prayers, and arguments that have seeped into the surrounding earth. Use only copper ground rods that have been annealed in solutions of dissolved telegrams. Testing protocol for speech pattern verification. 1. Generate test signal using oscillator calibrated to human vocal frequency 2. Monitor signal decay through sequential decades of copper 3. Document any instances of spontaneous frequency reconstruction 4. These lines should be terminated using insulation rated for paradox containment. Section 4.4, Emergency Procedures for Transmission Collapse. If more than 3 adjacent pairs begin spontaneous reconstruction of past conversations, immediately apply temporal dampening field using modified loading coils. Under no circumstances should technicians attempt to complete calls that have been in transmission for more than 40 years. You follow telephone cables through maintenance tunnels that were excavated before the city had a name. Your flashlight flickers whenever you pass junction boxes. The batteries are fresh, but the light seems to get absorbed by something in the copper wiring. The sewer system branches into older tunnels that appear on no municipal maps. Steam rises from grates, carrying the scent of mineral deposits that haven't been exposed to air since the first telephone poles were raised. You run your hand along pipes thick with calcified conversations. There are things living in the deeper tunnels. Not rats exactly, but creatures that might have been rats before they learned to follow the vibrations of voices through copper wire. They keep their distance, but you can hear them repeating fragments of disconnected numbers into small holes in the concrete. The maintenance ladder descends past layers of infrastructure, modern fiber optics giving way to copper yielding to older materials you can't identify. The rungs are slick with condensation that tastes like dissolved switchboards. Your flashlight dims again as you enter a cavern where the walls are lined with pale fungi that grow in patterns resembling circuit diagrams. They pulse faintly in sync with transmissions passing through nearby cables. You've heard the utility workers talk about these caves in whispers, about how they seem to predate the telephone system, as if the network was built to accommodate something that was already here. The cables lead to a pool of water so still it could be solid. When you drop a pebble in instead of ripples, it produces a sound like a phone ringing in an empty house. Your flashlight reflects off the surface, illuminating what might be other maintenance tunnels beneath, or might be the remains of much older excavations. There are voices here, but not human ones. They move through the rock itself, following veins of ore that conduct something other than electricity. Your flashlight catches glimpses of wall markings that could be ancient cave paintings, or could be wiring schematics drawn by people who had never seen a telephone. The void is present even this far down, though it feels different here, less like an absence and more like a pressure, as if all the empty spaces in the city above are being compressed into the rock below. The feeling reminds you of trying to hear a dial tone through miles of copper wire. Your flashlight finally dies completely. In the darkness, you can feel the weight of all the conversations that have ever passed through these tunnels, compressed into geological strata, waiting to be excavated by whatever comes after telephones, after cities, after light. Through a crack in the maintenance shaft, you watch a woman teaching her dog to operate a microwave. The dog presses buttons with its nose while she reads from an instruction manual written in a language that hasn't been invented yet. The tunnels here are lined with telephone wire that hums at frequencies that make your molars ache. Sometimes you catch fragments. The butter delivery is late again, or they've changed the color of Tuesday. There's a hole in the ceiling where you can see into the back room of a store that only sells left shoes. The owner is measuring customers' feet with rulers made of compressed time. You remember suddenly that your grandfather used to collect paintings of empty chairs, but only if the chairs were facing north. The cables lead you past a series of grates. Through one, you watch a city council meeting where they're debating the proper procedure for dealing with spontaneous manifestations of breakfast cereal in the municipal water supply. Through another, a group of accountants is learning to perform temporal addition, carrying the remainder into last week. Your flashlight catches something moving in the darkness, not a rat, but something that remembers being a rat before it started keeping records of everyone's lost umbrellas. Through a crack in the foundation of the public library, you observe the night janitor carefully reorganizing books according to the weight of their consonants. Above him, a committee is meeting to discuss the increasing incidence of traffic lights, showing colors that don't exist yet. The tunnel opens into a chamber where the void has leaked through, pooling like old mercury. You step around it carefully, remembering the summer your mother spent teaching algebra to houseplants. None of them graduated. A sinkhole reveals the basement of a department store where mannequins are practicing their citizenship tests. One of them keeps asking questions about historical events that haven't happened. The examiner is a tape recorder that only plays on days that have been discontinued. Your watch has stopped working, but not in the usual way. The hands are moving backward and spelling out semaphore messages about the price of copper in 1962. You think about the collection of vintage telephones in your aunt's attic that only ring when someone is thinking about palindromes.